The cowboy reached the train platform covered in snow, just as the woman he'd taken in was about to disappear from his life forever. Wyatt's boots hit the frozen platform hard enough to shake loose snow from the railing. His horse stood behind him, trembling and white, with sweat from the mountain ride. Lucille clutched her suitcase tighter when she saw him, her ticket half crushed in her glove. The train whistle echoed through Pine Creek Station, while neither of them moved first. And then Wyatt finally spoke. "If this story finds your heart tonight, stay with us." Winter came early to Red Hollow in 1888. By the second week of November, the roads had hardened into rutted gray tracks, and the wind rolling down from the northern Colorado mountains carried ice sharp enough to split skin. The wooden signs outside the feed store groaned all night long. Smoke clung low above the town like something too tired to rise. Lucille Harper sat at the piano near the dining room wall and kept her fingers moving across the yellowed keys while men ate stew and drank burnt coffee beneath the hanging lamps. The boarding house smelled of tobacco, wet wool, and frying onions. Boots dragged mud across the floorboards. Somewhere upstairs, a woman coughed behind a closed door. Lucille knew every sound in that building. The creak near the kitchen stairs, the loose hinge beside room 7, the way a man laughed when he still had money in his pocket, and the quieter kind of laugh that came after he'd lost too much to cards and wanted everyone else to believe he hadn't. She had worked there almost 6 years, long enough that people stopped asking where she came from, long enough that they only called her the piano girl now, Mr. Harlan, the owner, stood behind the front counter, counting bills beneath the lamp. His suspenders hung crooked over his shirt belly. One of the railmen was talking too loud about cattle prices down in Pueblo, while another slept with his hat tipped over his face. Outside, the wind hit the windows hard enough to rattle them. Lucille finished the song and reached for her coffee cup. Cold already, then she heard it. The slam of the register drawer. A long silence followed. Too long. She looked up. Mr. Harlan stared into the open till, face pale beneath his whiskers. "The money's gone." Nobody moved at first. The room simply stopped breathing. Harlan looked around once, then again harder, eyes narrowing as if the answer had already settled somewhere in his mind. "How much?" somebody asked. "Enough." His gaze landed on Lucille. The whole room followed it. She felt it happen one face at a time. Not surprise, recognition. Like people had been waiting for permission to think badly of her out loud. Harlan came around the counter fast enough to knock over a chair. "You were nearest the desk all evening." Lucille stood slowly. "I didn't take your money." "Then who did?" "I don't know." He laughed once through his nose. "That so?" Nobody spoke for her. Not the cattlemen she'd poured coffee for through 3 winters. Not the rail workers who tipped their hats every morning. Not the drummer from Kansas City, who once said she played piano prettier than any woman west of Denver. One man lowered his eyes into his bowl. Another suddenly became very interested in cleaning mud off his boot. Lucille looked from face to face and understood something cold and simple. People believed whatever fit easiest, and a woman working in a boarding house near the rail line fit easy. Harlan pointed toward the door. "Get your things." The wind outside shrieked against the walls. "Mr. Harlan, you heard me." Her cheeks burned hot despite the cold creeping under the doorframe. "You think I'd steal from you after 6 years? I think women in places like this learn how to survive however they can." That landed harder than shouting would have. Lucille swallowed once. Then she nodded. No tears, not there. She walked upstairs beneath the sound of chairs scraping and low voices restarting behind her. Room 12 sat at the end of the hall beside the back stairs. Small iron bed, wash basin, one cracked mirror. Everything she owned fit into a single worn suitcase. By the time she came back downstairs, nobody looked directly at her anymore. That somehow felt worse. Snow had started falling when she stepped outside. Thin at first, then heavier. The cold caught immediately in her throat. She walked past the side alley beside the kitchen and around toward the horse shed behind the building, where the wind cut less sharply through the boards. A lantern swung slowly overhead, throwing weak yellow light across the packed snow. Lucille set her suitcase down beside a stack of feed sacks and sat on the overturned bucket near the fence. For a long time she listened to the storm building over Red Hollow. A horse stamped somewhere nearby. Laughter drifted faintly from the saloon across the street. The whole town kept moving. Like nothing had happened at all. She pressed both hands together between her knees to stop their shaking. The crying came quietly, not dramatic, not loud, just exhaustion finally slipping loose where nobody could see it. Then came the sound of hoofbeats, slow, even, not hurried against the weather. Lucille wiped quickly beneath her eyes before the rider rounded the fence line. A gray horse appeared first through the falling snow, then the rider, tall, broad shoulders beneath a dark canvas coat, dusted white. The horse stopped beside the gate. The man looked at her once, not the quick kind of look men usually gave her, not measuring, not curious, just steady. His eyes dropped briefly to her hands curled red from the cold, then to the suitcase. When he spoke, his voice came low and roughened by winter air. "Storm's getting worse." Lucille nodded once. The man dismounted slowly. Snow creaked beneath his boots. She recognized him then. Wyatt Boone. Owned a cattle ranch somewhere beyond Elk Ridge. Kept mostly to himself. Came into town twice a month for supplies and left before dark. People said he hadn't taken supper with another soul in years. He stood beside the fence with one gloved hand resting lightly against the saddle horn. He did not ask her what happened. Did not ask whether she stole the money. Did not ask why she was sitting behind a boarding house crying in the snow. Instead, he looked toward the storm swallowing the road north. Then back at her. "Come home and eat before the storm gets worse." Lucille stared at him. The words settled strangely in the cold air between them. Not flirtation, not pity, just plain certainty. Like offering shelter to someone freezing beside the road was the simplest thing in the world. She opened her mouth once, closed it again. "The town will talk," she said quietly. "I expect it will." He said it easy. No pretending otherwise. That mattered more than if he'd denied it. Snow gathered along the shoulders of his coat while he waited. Lucille looked down toward the suitcase at her feet. There were no trains until Thursday. No rooms left she could afford. No one else had stopped. Finally, she rose from the bucket. Her knees had stiffened from the cold. Wyatt reached for the suitcase before she could lift it herself. He carried it without asking permission and secured it behind the saddle. Then he held the horse steady while she climbed up. Lucille settled carefully onto the back of the saddle, keeping space between them. The lights of Red Hollow glowed dim through the snow behind them as Wyatt turned the horse toward the north road. Nobody waved goodbye. Nobody called after her. But curtains shifted. Doors cracked open. The whole town watched anyway. Wyatt clicked softly to the horse, and they started up the frozen road toward Elk Ridge while the storm closed behind them. Lucille held onto the back of the saddle with numb fingers and kept her eyes forward. The wind howled across the dark valley, but for the first time that night, she was no longer sitting alone in it. The ride north from Red Hollow took nearly 2 hours through rising snow. Lucille sat stiff behind Wyatt Boone, one hand gripping the back of the saddle while the other held her coat closed at the throat. The gray horse moved steadily along the narrow mountain road, steam lifting from its body in the freezing dark. Neither of them spoke much. Once, Wyatt asked if she was warm enough. She said yes, even though she could no longer feel her feet. He did not press the matter. The lamps of town disappeared behind them, little by little until there was nothing left except snow, pine trees, and the distant black shape of the mountains. Then finally she saw it. A low ranch house sitting alone beneath Elk Ridge. One lantern burned near the porch. Another glowed through the kitchen window. A barn stood farther back beside a fenced pen where two horses shifted in the snow. The place looked worn but cared for. Not rich, not neglected either, just quiet. Wyatt dismounted first and tied the horse near the porch rail. Lucille climbed down carefully, boots crunching in the snow. Her legs nearly buckled from the cold, though she hid it quickly. Wyatt noticed anyway. Inside, he said. The kitchen was warm from the iron stove glowing near the wall. A pot sat pushed back over low heat. Coffee grounds rested in a tin beside the basin. Wet gloves hung drying near the door. The room smelled faintly of cedar smoke and beef broth. Lucille stood just inside the doorway while snow melted off her coat hem onto the floorboards. Wyatt removed his hat and pointed toward the stove. "You can sit there." She moved closer carefully, holding her hands near the heat without quite touching the iron. The feeling returned slowly to her fingers, painful first, then dull. Wyatt ladled stew into 2 bowls without ceremony. Potatoes, carrots, chunks of beef cooked soft from hours over low flame. He set a bowl in front of her beside thick bread wrapped in cloth. Lucille stared at the food longer than she meant to. "You should eat while it's hot," he said. She nodded once. The first spoonful nearly undid her, not because the stew was special, because it was warm, because nobody was accusing her of anything while she ate it. The room stayed quiet except for the wind outside and the ticking of the stove iron cooling and warming again. After a while, Wyatt stood and picked up her suitcase. "There's a room beside the kitchen," he said. "Beds small but clean." Lucille set down her spoon. "I won't stay long." "You can stay till the road's clear. That may take days." Then days again. He said it like the simplest thing in the world. He carried the suitcase down the short hallway and opened the door to a narrow room with a single bed beneath the window. A folded quilt rested at the foot. A wash basin sat on a crate beside the wall. Nothing fancy, but the blanket smelled fresh. Lucille touched the edge of it lightly. "When did someone last stay here?" she asked. Wyatt paused a moment. "My mother." The answer settled quietly between them. He left before she could think of what to say back. Later that night, Lucille sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the storm hammer, the ranch house. She could hear Wyatt moving once or twice in the kitchen. Boots across the floorboards. Water poured into a basin. Then silence again. No drinking, no shouting. No men laughing downstairs beneath her room. Just wind. She had almost forgotten a place could sound like that. Morning came pale and frozen. Lucille woke early out of habit. For a few confused seconds she stared at the ceiling without recognizing it. Then she remembered everything all at once. The missing money. The faces turned away from hers. The snow. Wyatt Boone standing beside the fence with his hat full of snowflakes. She dressed quietly and stepped into the kitchen. Wyatt already sat at the table, drinking coffee from a chipped brown mug. Snowlight filled the room through the frosted windows. He looked up once as she entered. "Mornin', mornin'." There was another mug already waiting beside the stove, fresh coffee, not an accident. Lucille wrapped both hands around it and stood there a moment letting the warmth settle into her palms. Wyatt slid a small, folded paper across the table toward her. She frowned slightly. "What's this?" "Receipt from Henderson's feed store." She looked closer. "The oats you paid for yesterday afternoon." Lucille blinked once. "I didn't ask for that." "No," he said. "But Harlan's likely already told half the county you're a thief." Her eyes lifted slowly toward him. Wyatt leaned back slightly in the chair. "Figured paper's useful when folks start deciding things." Something tightened unexpectedly in her throat. Nobody had defended her with evidence before. Most people just chose whichever story caused the least inconvenience. She folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket. "Thank you." He nodded once and drank his coffee. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them discussed aloud. Lucille repaired a torn kitchen curtain with thread she found in an old sewing tin. She swept the porch after snowstorms. She cooked cornbread one afternoon because she found cornmeal stored in the pantry beside dried beans and canned peaches. Wyatt never commented much, but he always ate everything she made. One morning, she found him outside trying to clean the ice packed into the hoof of an old bay mare, limping near the fence. Lucille crouched beside him without speaking and held the lantern lower while he worked. The mare shivered once in the cold. Wyatt glanced briefly toward Lucille's bare hands, turning pink in the morning air. "You should have brought gloves. You should have too." For the first time, she saw the corner of his mouth shift slightly. Not fully a smile, close enough to notice. The piano came 3 days later. Lucille discovered it accidentally in the old storage shed behind the barn beneath a canvas cloth layered thick with dust. One key stuck badly near the center. 2 ivory caps were missing. Still, it was a piano. That evening after supper, while Wyatt checked the horses outside, she slipped into the shed and lifted the cover. Her fingers hesitated above the keys before finally pressing down softly. The sound came rough and thin from years without tuning, but music filled the room anyway. Slow, careful, the kind of tune meant for empty places. Outside the shed door, Wyatt stopped in the snow and listened without entering. Lucille did not know he was there. He stood with one hand, resting lightly against the doorframe, while yellow lantern light spilled across the snow between his boots. Inside, her fingers moved across the worn keys, while the storm clouds gathered low over Elk Ridge again. And for the first time in many years, the ranch house no longer sounded empty. The trouble started the next trip into town. Lucille felt it before anyone spoke directly. 2 women outside the dry goods store lowered their voices too late when she passed. A ranch hand she recognized from the boarding house suddenly found reason to cross the street instead of tipping his hat. At Keller's general store, silence spread in small circles ahead of her, like ripples through water. Lucille kept her eyes on her shopping list. Coffee, flour, lamp oil, needles. Mrs. Barlow, the banker's wife, stood near the counter wrapped in a dark blue winter coat trimmed with fox fur. Her smile arrived first, thin as paper. A decent man ought to think carefully about the sort of company he keeps around his home. Nobody answered. The store smelled of leather and cold air and ground coffee. Lucille folded the list once in her hand. Mrs. Barlow adjusted one glove finger slowly, especially a man living alone. Lucille looked at her then, not angry, just tired. "Is there a reason you're speaking to me instead of him?" That landed harder than shouting would have. Mrs. Barlow's smile tightened. Lucille paid for the supplies and left without another word. But that night, after Wyatt went to check the barn before dark, she quietly opened the drawer beside the bed in her room and began folding her dresses back into the suitcase. The ranch house sat still around her. Wind brushed softly against the windows now. The storm from earlier in the week had finally passed, leaving the valley buried beneath hard white snow that glittered blue beneath moonlight. Lucille folded the dark green dress first, then the brown one with the repaired sleeve. Everything neat. Everything ready to disappear without leaving much trace behind. She paused only once when she heard Wyatt's boots crossing the porch outside. A moment later, the kitchen door opened. Cold air drifted briefly through the hallway, carrying the smell of hay and horses. Then silence again. Lucille closed the suitcase halfway, but did not latch it. She sat on the edge of the bed afterward, with both hands resting in her lap, listening to the soft sounds of Wyatt moving around the kitchen. A cupboard opening, water poured into a basin. The scrape of wood against the stove, ordinary sounds that somehow made leaving harder. By morning, the sky had cleared hard and bright over Elk Ridge. Wyatt was already outside repairing part of the north fence where drifting snow had knocked loose 2 rails during the storm. Lucille stood at the kitchen window, holding her coffee cup, and watched him from behind the curtain a moment longer than she meant to. He worked steadily, No wasted movement. Heavy gloves. Wool coat. Breath turning white in the cold. The old bay mare limped slowly behind the fence, nearby, following him like she trusted he would eventually notice whatever hurt. Maybe that was the sort of man he was. Lucille looked away first. Later that afternoon, Wyatt returned from town carrying a leather document case beneath one arm. Snow dusted the shoulders of his coat. Something about his face had changed. Not anger, not exactly, but tighter somehow. He removed his gloves slowly beside the stove and laid several folded papers across the kitchen table. Lucille glanced toward them while slicing potatoes for supper. "Trouble?" she asked. Wyatt rested both hands briefly against the chair back before answering. Silas Grady filed a new claim over the North Creek. Lucille stopped cutting. Everybody in 3 counties knew the name Silas Grady, cattle baron. Owned land stretching nearly to the Arkansas River. The sort of man who bought judges whiskey and called it friendship. Wyatt unfolded one of the papers. Claims the water line belongs to his grazing territory now. Lucille frowned slightly. Can he do that? He's trying. The North Creek mattered. Without it, Wyatt's cattle would dry out by midsummer. Every rancher near the mountains understood what water meant. Lucille wiped her hands on the dish towel and stepped closer to the table. The papers smelled faintly of tobacco and cold air. Survey maps, boundary notes, official stamps from the county office in Colorado Springs. Then she saw the signature, now the bottom corner, Milton Reed. Her eyes stopped there. Something old shifted quietly behind them. Wyatt noticed. "You know him?" Lucille looked down again at the paper. "Yes." The room stayed still. Outside, wind rattled softly through the porch boards. Wyatt waited without pressing. That made it easier somehow. Lucille touched the edge of the document lightly with one finger. He used to come through the boarding house. Wyatt pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly. When? Couple years back. Maybe more. She tried to return to the potatoes, but her hands had slowed. "There was a night," she said quietly. "Late spring. Rainy enough nobody wanted to ride home after dark." Wyatt had said nothing. Lucille stared at the papers instead of him. Milton Reed sat in the dining room with Silas Grady and another man, surveyor maybe. They drank half a bottle of bourbon between them. She swallowed once. "They thought I wasn't listening." Wyatt leaned back slightly in the chair. Lucille could still remember the smell of wet coats that night. Cigarette smoke drifting beneath the lamp. Rain striking the boarding house windows. Silas had spread maps across the table while she refilled glasses beside them. Men like that rarely noticed women carrying coffee, especially women at pianos. They kept arguing over a creek line, she said. Milton wanted more money before he changed the records. Wyatt's eyes narrowed slightly. "You remember that?" Lucille finally looked at him then. "I remember everything people say around me when they think I don't matter." The kitchen went quiet. A log shifted softly inside the stove. Wyatt looked back down at the survey papers. "What else do you remember?" Lucille sat slowly across from him. "The amount. How much?" $800. That caught his attention. In 1888, $800 could buy a ranch house outright in some counties. Lucille continued carefully. There was another man there, too. Sheriff's clerk from Black Pine. Thomas Avery. Wyatt stared at her now with full attention. Not doubt. Attention. Real attention. Lucille felt it immediately. "They joked about the county maps," she said. "Said nobody checks creek boundaries till drought season anyway." Wyatt rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. "You're certain?" "Yes, how?" Her expression changed slightly then. Tired. Almost amused. "When you spend 6 years carrying coffee around drunk men, you learn listening's safer than talking." Something moved briefly across Wyatt's face. Not pity. Something quieter. Respect, maybe. Lucille suddenly became aware of how close they sat at the table. The fading daylight, the coffee cooling untouched between them. The way he was looking at her like the things she remembered. mattered. That felt unfamiliar enough to make her uneasy. She stood too quickly and carried the potatoes back toward the stove. I don't know if any of it helps now. It helps, Wyatt said. His voice came low and certain behind her. Lucille kept her back turned while she stirred the pot. For a little while, neither spoke again. Then Wyatt rose from the chair and gathered the papers back into order. I'll need someone to say this, official. Lucille's hand stopped briefly against the spoon. The room seemed smaller suddenly. Outside, snow slipped softly from the barn roof. You mean testify? Yes, she stared into the steam rising from the pot. Immediately she could hear the town already. Questions, smirks, men pretending concern while dragging her name through mud all over again. Silas Grady's lawyer would ask where she worked, what kind of men visited the boarding house, why anyone should trust a woman like her. Lucille closed her eyes once, slowly. When she turned around again, Wyatt was watching her carefully, not pushing, waiting. If I do this, she said quietly, they'll come after you too. I know. They'll say you brought me there to lie for you. I expect they will. Again, he said it plainly. No pretending otherwise. That same steadiness from the night behind the boarding house. Lucille looked toward the dark window above the sink. Her reflection stared faintly back at her, beside the stove light. Tired eyes. Loose strand of hair near one cheek. A woman most people already decided things about, before she ever opened her mouth. Then she looked back at Wyatt Boone, at the papers, at the man who had never once asked her to become smaller, so the world would feel more comfortable around her. All right, she said finally. Wyatt did not smile, but something in him eased. He nodded once, and for reasons she did not entirely understand, that small movement settled deeper inside her chest than any grand promise could have. The hearing was set for the following Thursday. Word spread through Red Hollow faster than weather. By Tuesday afternoon, men were already leaning across counters, discussing it over coffee cups and poker hands. Women paused outside the post office beneath scarves and fur collars, lowering their voices when Lucille's name entered the conversation. Some called it a land dispute. Most called it entertainment. The morning of the hearing came bitter cold. A hard wind moved through town carrying dusted snow along the road in thin white ribbons. Horses stamped outside the sheriff's office, while wagons lined both sides of the street. Lucille stood inside Wyatt's kitchen, buttoned the cuffs of her dark blue dress, with fingers that would not quite steady themselves. The dress was plain, high collar, long sleeves. No jewelry except the small silver pin her mother once owned. Still, when she looked at herself in the mirror above the wash basin, she felt exposed somehow. Wyatt stood near the stove, pulling on his gloves. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. Lucille met his eyes through the mirror. Yes, she answered after a moment. I do. The ride into town passed mostly in silence. Snow creaked beneath the wagon wheels. Frost clung to fence posts and cedar branches all along the road leading into Red Hollow. When they crossed the bridge near Miller Creek, Lucille could already see people gathered outside the sheriff's office, waiting. Wyatt climbed down first, once they arrived, and tied the horse near the rail. Then he held out his hand to help her from the wagon. Lucille hesitated only a second before placing her gloved hand into his. His grip stayed steady. Not lingering, just there. The crowd quieted as they crossed the street together. Lucille felt every eye in town move over her coat, her face the way she walked beside Wyatt Boone. A ranch hand near the barber shop muttered something, low enough he probably thought she wouldn't hear. Whole counties stopping work to listen to a boarding house girl now. Another man laughed through his nose. Lucille kept walking. Inside, the hearing room smelled of cold wood, damp wool, and cigar smoke trapped in the walls. A potbelly stove crackled near the back benches where townspeople crowded shoulder to shoulder for warmth and gossip. Sheriff Nolan Pierce stood near the front, speaking quietly with the county clerk. Silas Grady sat beside his lawyer near the windows. Expensive coat, silver watch chain. The kind of man who smiled like ownership came naturally to him. His eyes moved toward Lucille as she entered. Not surprised, just irritated, like finding dust on polished boots. Wyatt pulled out a chair for her beside the front table. Again, that small, simple politeness nearly unsettled her more than cruelty would have. The hearing began shortly after 10. At first, it stayed dry and technical. Survey lines, water access, county records. Milton Reed sat stiff-backed near the clerk's desk, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief, despite the cold. Lucille noticed that immediately. Then Silas's lawyer stood. Tall man from Denver named Everett Shaw. Smooth hair, smooth voice, kind of polite. He questioned Wyatt first, then the surveyor. Then finally he turned toward Lucille. "Well," he said lightly. "Miss Harper." The room shifted. People leaned forward. Lucille folded both hands tightly in her lap beneath the table. "You worked at Harlan's boarding house for several years?" "Yes. And during those years you frequently served alcohol to travelers and railroad men." "I served meals and coffee." A few low chuckles moved through the benches. Everett Shaw smiled faintly. "Of course, and in such a lively establishment, conversation must have flowed freely." Lucille said nothing. Shaw stepped closer. "You expect this court to believe you recall one specific discussion from nearly 2 years ago?" "Yes, perfectly." No one said perfectly. That drew another ripple through the room. Shaw tilted his head slightly. "And yet here you are accusing respected businessmen based entirely on overheard conversation while carrying plates around a boarding house dining room." The word boarding house lingered deliberately. Lucille felt heat climb slowly beneath her collar. Not shame exactly. Old humiliation waking back up, Shaw continued smoothly. "Tell me, Miss Harper, how many drinks had you served that evening?" Lucille looked directly at him then. "I wasn't the one drinking." A sharper laugh burst somewhere in the back before quickly dying again. Shaw's smile thinned. "You understand, of course, that some people might question the reliability of a woman in your position." There it was, not shouted. Worse because it wasn't. Lucille suddenly became aware of every person watching her breathe. Every whisper that had followed her through Red Hollow. Every doorway conversation cut short when she walked past. Her hands tightened harder together beneath the table. Then Shaw spoke again. "Isn't it true, Miss Harper, that your interest in this matter only began after moving into Mr. Boone's home?" Something ugly shifted through the room. Lucille heard it immediately, the low change in breathing, the assumptions arriving. She opened her mouth once. Nothing came out. Shaw saw it. Pressed harder. "Perhaps you simply wish to help the man keeping a roof over your head." A few men laughed openly this time. Lucille felt herself go cold. Not outside cold, the deeper kind. For one terrible second, she wished she had never come. Then a chair scraped sharply across the floor. Wyatt stood. The sound alone silenced half the room. He did not raise his voice. That somehow made it carry farther. "She remembers more truth than most men in this town are brave enough to speak." Nobody moved, not even Shaw. Wyatt looked directly toward the back benches, where the laughter had come from. She listened, while men twice her age and 3 times as drunk talked openly because none of you ever thought she was worth noticing. The silence deepened. "You don't get to use that against her now." Lucille stared at him. Something inside her chest hurt suddenly in a way she did not know how to name. Not because he defended her, because he sounded angry on her behalf, as though her dignity belonged to him too somehow. Across the room, Milton Reed began breathing harder. Sheriff Pierce noticed immediately. "So help me, God, Milton," he said quietly. "If there's something you need to say, now's your time." Milton pulled at his collar. His eyes darted once toward Silas Grady. Silas's face had gone flat as stone. Another long second passed. Then Milton Reed broke. He admitted the payment. The altered survey lines, the forged creek measurements filed under county seal. The room exploded afterward, voices rising, boots scraping, someone near the stove cursing loudly. Sheriff Pierce slammed his hand against the desk for order, while Silas Grady shouted at Milton across the room. Through all of it, Lucille sat perfectly still. Wyatt lowered slowly back into his chair beside her. Neither spoke, but his arm rested near enough beside hers that she could feel the warmth through both their coats. Outside afterward, the wind had picked back up. Crowds spilled into the street, carrying the story with them in every direction. Lucille and Wyatt walked toward the wagon beneath a gray afternoon sky while church bells rang somewhere farther down Main Street. They were almost to the hitch rail when two men standing outside the saloon spoke low behind them. Not low enough. Boone ruined his future over a saloon woman. The other man spat into the snow. Ain't a rancher alive who keeps his name clean after something like that. Lucille's steps slowed only slightly. Wyatt turned his head once toward the voices, but she touched his sleeve before he could say anything. "It's fine," she said quietly. He looked down at her. Neither of them believed that. That night, the ranch house felt different somehow. Too quiet. Lucille sat awake long after midnight, listening to the wind moving softly across Elk Ridge. The suitcase remained beneath her bed where she had shoved it days earlier. Around 2 in the morning, she finally rose, lit the small lamp beside the basin, and pulled the suitcase back out into the room. This time, she finished packing. The ranch house stayed quiet around her. Somewhere beyond the walls, wind moved softly through the pine trees along Elk Ridge. The old clock near the kitchen stove ticked slow and steady through the dark. Lucille folded Wyatt's mended scarf last, gray wool. One corner still uneven where she'd stitched it beside the fire 3 nights earlier while he cleaned tack near the table. She held it a moment longer than she meant to, then laid it carefully atop the suitcase. By dawn, the kitchen still carried warmth from the stove fire, banked low overnight. Wyatt's coffee cup sat drying beside the sink. His gloves rested near the door where he always left them. Lucille stood alone in the middle of the room, wearing her coat. The house smelled faintly of cedar smoke and coffee grounds. Home. That was the dangerous part. Not the gossip, not the town. The fact that somewhere between the snowstorms and the quiet suppers and the piano in the shed, this lonely little ranch had begun feeling like somewhere her body recognized before her mind allowed it to. She set the room key beside Wyatt's coffee cup. Then she placed the folded scarf next to it. Outside, first light barely touched the mountains when she climbed into the stagecoach, leaving Red Hollow for Pine Creek Station. The driver took her suitcase without question. "Road'll ice over before noon," he muttered. "Lucky you caught the early run." Lucille nodded and settled near the window beneath a wool blanket that smelled faintly of dust and horse leather. As the coach pulled away, Elk Ridge disappeared slowly behind drifting snow. She did not look back again after that. At the ranch, Wyatt woke just after sunrise to silence. Not unusual silence. Wrong silence. He noticed it first in the kitchen. No coffee warming on the stove. No movement from the small room beside the hall. Then he saw the key, the scarf, and beside them, one folded piece of paper torn from the edge of an old feed receipt. "Thank you for the kindness. I won't be the reason people speak badly of your name any longer," that was all. Wyatt stood there a long moment, holding the note between rough, work-worn fingers. Outside, the gray horse stamped impatiently in the cold. An hour later, he was already riding north through the mountain road. Snow blew hard across the pass near Broken Timber Ridge. Wind cut through his coat and froze against the scarf wrapped high at his throat. The same scarf she'd repaired. He rode anyway. By midday, the stagecoach reached Pine Creek Station, a narrow rail stop tucked against the mountains where freight trains passed twice a week heading west. Lucille stood beneath the station awning while snow drifted across the tracks. 2 soldiers smoked near the loading platform. A woman in a dark traveling coat argued quietly with the ticket clerk inside. Lucille held her suitcase beside her boots and watched steam rise from somewhere beyond the hills. She had almost convinced herself she'd done the right thing. Then she heard hoofbeats, fast, coming hard through the snow. The station master stepped outside, squinting toward the road. A few seconds later, Wyatt Boone rode into view through the white wind, his gray horse lathered dark at the neck from the climb. He pulled hard on the reins near the platform and dismounted immediately. Snow clung thick across his shoulders and hat brim. For a second, neither of them moved. Lucille's fingers tightened around the suitcase handle. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly. Wyatt walked toward her slowly, breath still uneven from the ride. "You left before breakfast." The answer nearly broke something inside her. People moved quietly around them, boots across the platform boards, steam hissing somewhere farther down the tracks. But the world had narrowed strangely around the two of them. Lucille shook her head once. "They were right. About what? About me hurting your future." Wyatt stopped directly in front of her now, close enough that melted snow dripped from the brim of his hat onto the station boards between them. "That house stopped feeling empty when you walked into it," he said. Lucille looked down quickly. The wind pushed loose strands of hair across her cheek. "You don't mean that." "Yes," he said simply. "I do." Her throat tightened painfully. For weeks she had prepared herself for kindness to end the way it always did. Slowly, quietly. Once people started talking loud enough. But Wyatt Boone stood there in the middle of a snowstorm after riding half the county to find her. Not embarrassed, not hesitant, certain. Lucille tried once more to steady herself. "You only think this because you feel sorry for me." Something changed in his face then. Not anger, something deeper. "You came to that ranch hungry," he said quietly. "Cold, too. Looked like the whole world had already decided things about you before you ever opened your mouth." He stepped one pace closer. Somewhere along the way, he stopped briefly, like the words felt unfamiliar in his mouth. "I forgot how to eat supper without waiting for you." The station sounds faded strangely after that. Lucille stared at him through the blowing snow. Nobody had ever spoken to her like that before. Not wanting something, not bargaining, just telling the truth plain and steady. Her eyes burned suddenly. She turned her face away. Too late. Wyatt saw the tears anyway. This time she did not hide them. He removed one glove slowly and rested his hand lightly against her cheek, warm despite the cold. Lucille closed her eyes briefly beneath the touch. The arriving train whistle echoed faintly through the mountains. Neither of them moved toward it. Spring came slowly to Elk Ridge after that winter. Snow melted down the hillsides in silver streams. Grass returned in thin green patches near the creek bed. The old bay mare finally stopped limping. Lucille stayed. By April, she had turned part of the ranch kitchen into a small supper room for travelers crossing the mountain road. Nothing fancy. Coffee, stew, fresh bread cooling near the window. Cowboys started stopping there, regular enough that Wyatt eventually built 2 more tables himself beside the wall. And one warm evening near sunset, Lucille walked into the old storage shed and found the piano repaired, every broken key replaced, the wood polished clean. Wyatt stood awkwardly near the doorway, holding a wrench in one hand. "Fellow in Denver owed me a favor," he said. Lucille touched the piano, softly with her fingertips. Then she looked at him, really looked at him. The quiet man who brought strangers home during snowstorms, who listened more than he spoke, who rode through a mountain pass because he could not but thought of her, leaving without knowing she mattered. That night, lantern light glowed warm through the ranch windows, while spring rain tapped softly against the roof. Lucille stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping flour from her hands. "Wyatt," she called gently. "Supper's ready." He stepped onto the porch, pulling off his work gloves slowly. For a moment he simply stood there, watching her in the doorway with lamplight behind her and mountains fading blue beyond the valley. Then he smiled, small, real, and walked inside. The door closed softly behind him, while smoke rose steady from the chimney into the cooling Colorado evening. Outside, the wind still moved across Elk Ridge the same way it always had. But inside the little ranch house, nobody was lonely anymore. And maybe that's the part that stays with a person after a story like this ends. Not the courtroom, not the gossip, not even the long ride through the snow. It's the thought of walking through life, believing there's no place left where your name feels safe. And then finding one small kitchen with a warm stove, a lamp still burning, and somebody quietly waiting for you to come home. Most folks know what it feels like to carry something heavy for too long. Shame, grief, regret. The fear that people have already decided who you are before you get the chance to speak for yourself. Lucille spent years surviving that way. And Wyatt, well, some people get so used to eating alone, they stop noticing the silence at their own table. Until one day they do. Maybe that's why stories like this matter. Because every once in a while, life gives a tired soul another seat by the fire, another chance to stay, another reason to believe the cold doesn't last forever. If this story stayed with you tonight, let me know down in the comments where you're listening from. And if you'd like, you can stay a while longer here with us. There are still more quiet roads, old ranch houses, lost hearts, and healing stories waiting in the next one.